Wow, what a wonderful turnout. This is, for somebody who's been involved with disability rights situations for a long time, this is really gratifying to see so many people interested. So between now and March of 2012, approximately 100,000 commercial swimming pools will be faced with providing access for people with disabilities. The purpose of today's seminar is to present an overview of the new legislation that is triggering this demand, so that your company can be better prepared to take advantage of this opportunity. Today's presentation will provide an overview of the ADA in general. We will discuss the evolution, background, and implementation of the ADA law. Then we will spend some time just going through the specific regulations for swimming pools. And then we will review possible marketing opportunities that you can take advantage of as part of this new regulation. Our goal today is to make sure that you fully understand the ADA with respect to swimming pools. So why do we need an ADA? There are over 50 million people with disabilities in the United States. This represents about 18% of our population, which makes this our largest minority group. This number is actually larger when you consider that in many ways, age is also a disability. And as we baby boomers become senior boomers, that numbers will continue to increase. Like any previous legislation that was enacted to protect the civil rights of a specific group, the ADA is designed to prevent discrimination against a person based on a disability. The goal is to provide a level playing field so that a person with a disability can compete equally for jobs and also enjoy the same benefits of living in the United States as an able-bodied individual. Discrimination takes on many forms. Being disqualified from applying for employment is one form of discrimination. And just as Congress has passed legislation to prevent this type of discrimination based on race and gender, Title I of the ADA prohibits such discrimination for someone with a disability. Being barred from any activity because you simply can't get in the door is also another form of discrimination. Imagine, if you will, life in a wheelchair, where there were no curb cuts, no handicap parking places, no ramps leading to buildings, or any other type of access for someone with a disability. Prior to the ADA, it was unusual to see a person in a wheelchair. It was more unusual to see a person in a wheelchair working in an office, or eating in a restaurant, or going to a football game, or swimming in your local swimming pool. Because of architectural barriers like curbs and stairs, the difficulty in finding a workable parking place, narrow doorways, and unmanageable restrooms, people with disabilities simply stayed home. The goal of the ADA is to get people out of their homes so that they can become part of the mainstream of American society and allow all of us to benefit from their contribution. And a large part of providing a level playing field centers around barrier removal. To provide a better understanding of barrier removal, take a look at this swimming pool. Nothing's better than jumping into a nice, cool swimming pool on a hot summer's day. Now, this is how that same pool looks to a person with disabilities, especially a mobility impairment. Getting in and out of that pool for that person is about as difficult as climbing Mount Everest. This is how that pool looks to someone with a vision impairment. As you can see, it's difficult to find the edge of the pool, let alone tell whether or not there's water in it. These are examples of how architectural barriers create an environment of discrimination for a person with a disability. Because this pool is not accessible, a person with a disability is unable to freely participate in the activity alongside their able-bodied neighbors. The goal of the ADA is a level playing field. Ultimately, the real goal is inclusion, which actually goes far beyond accessibility. As disability pundit Scott Rains points out, providing accessibility often focuses on compliance and checklists and meeting the minimum obligations required to avoid lawsuits and fines. Inclusion goes beyond ramps and pool lifts. It defines an atmosphere where people with disabilities are viable parts of the mainstream. Accessibility describes an environment where society is doing for. Inclusion describes an environment where society is doing with. Everyone benefits from an inclusive society. People with disabilities are able to participate and contribute. The rest of us are able to reap the benefits of their participation. So what is the ADA? ADA is an acronym for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a wide-ranging civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination based on disability. The original act was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush on July 26 of 1990. This passage was the result of over 20 years of discussions within Congress on how best to provide that level playing field for people with disabilities. Once the law was signed, the task of defining exactly what accessibility means was given to a government department that's usually referred to as the U.S. Access Board. The Access Board is comprised of architects, engineers, designers, and other interested parties who set standards that are designed to remove barriers for people with disabilities. Once the Access Board develops such standards, they are passed along to the Department of Justice to be codified into law and enforced. In 1991, the first set of ADA regulations went into effect. Elements affected by these regulations are now part of the fabric of everyday society in the United States. These regulations resulted in curb cuts, handicap parking places, accessible bath and hotel rooms, ramps, and braille signage and wayfinding. Almost immediately after the release of the 1991 regulations, the Access Board began working on a revision to them, which would include areas that were either not covered or addressed in the 1991 version. Somewhere around 1995, the Access Board began work on accessibility requirements for swimming pools. After several revisions, much discussion, and thought, in September 2003, the board released the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines for Swimming Pools. This document is commonly called ADAG 2004. Now, since the Access Board has no enforcement authority, these guidelines were just that, guidelines. It was a foregone conclusion that eventually these guidelines would become law. They were released to serve as a guidance document for new construction and for pools undergoing modifications. The objective of this early release was to enable new construction projects to build to these standards so they would not have to make renovations and retrofits after these guidelines eventually did become law. On July 26th of 2010, the revision of the ADA was signed into law. And coincidentally, this date was the 20th anniversary of the signing of the original ADA law. The new regulations were published in the Federal Register on September 15th of 2010 and will go into effect on March 11th of 2011. Full compliance with these regulations will be required by March 15th, 2011.